world fell away beneath the helicopter's skids, swallowed by a churning sea of white and gray. One moment there was the familiar diesel-scented warmth of the base. The next, only the vast frozen maw of the Minnesota North Woods in December. The cold was not merely an absence of heat, it was a physical presence, a predatory entity that seeped through the fuselage, through our layers of Arctic gear, and bit deep into the bone. I watched the endless expanse of skeletal birch and pine scroll past, their branches heavy with snow, a landscape rendered in stark monochrome. This was to be our home for the next 72 hours, a winter survival training exercise. Routine. For the United States Army Rangers, routine was the bedrock of existence. Sergeant Miller's voice cut through the rotor wash's deafening thrum, a calm, steady anchor in the sensory chaos. He gestured sharply toward a clearing, a small white scar in the endless forest below. The Black Hawk tilted, its descent a controlled plummet into the frozen silence. The moment the skids kissed the snow, we were moving, a well-oiled machine of 7 men spilling out into the knee-deep powder. The helicopter, our last tangible link to civilization, lifted away, its roar fading until the only sound was the mournful sigh of the wind through the pines. The silence that rushed in to fill the void was profound and somehow accusing. We moved with the practiced efficiency that Sergeant Miller drilled into us. Packs were shrugged off, and the temporary base camp began to take shape with a quiet military precision. Corporal Lee and Private Davis started clearing a perimeter, their movements economical and sure. I helped Specialist Chen assemble the small Arctic-rated tent that would serve as our command post and shelter, my fingers already growing numb inside my thick gloves. For a brief moment, there was a flicker of normalcy, of camaraderie. Davis cracked a joke about the cold being worse than his ex-wife's heart, and a few gruff chuckles were shared. It was a fragile bubble of human warmth in an inhumanly cold world. The bubble popped when Davis stopped dead in his tracks. He was staring at the ground a dozen yards from our nascent camp, his rifle held a little tighter. Sergeant Miller saw it too and moved toward him, his posture rigid. The rest of us followed, the easy banter dying on our lips. There, stamped into the pristine snow, was a set of tracks. They were massive, larger than any bear or moose print I had ever seen, yet utterly unfamiliar. The deep impressions were oddly distorted, as if whatever made them had dragged its feet, blurring the definition into a series of deep, ominous pits in the snow. They led from the dark tree line, curved around the edge of our clearing, and vanished back into the forest. No one spoke. The biting cold seemed to intensify, seeping past our gear and settling deep in our chests. This was no longer just a training exercise. The untouched wilderness around us no longer felt empty, but watchful. Those strange, unidentifiable tracks had carved a single, undeniable message into the snow. We were not alone. And the feeling that settled over our squad was not curiosity, but a slow, creeping dread. The tracks were a poison in the snow, a creeping vine of dread that had taken root overnight. Where before there had been one set of distorted impressions, now a veritable highway of them encircled our camp, a macabre fence line drawn just beyond the tree line. Sergeant Miller ordered a patrol at first light, his face a granite mask, but the tension humming beneath his calm was a live wire we all felt. We moved out in a standard wedge formation, our breath pluming in the brittle air, the crunch of our boots on the frozen crust the only sound we dared make. It was Private Davis who found the new set, clearer and more defined in the soft powder beneath a canopy of spruce. He dropped to a knee, pointing. These were not the blurred, dragging marks from the day before. These were sharp, skeletal imprints, long and narrow, with a disturbing, almost humanoid structure. At the forefront of each print were 5 deep, vicious gouges, the marks of claws. They cut through the snow with a predatory elegance, a chilling contrast to the chaotic, heavy-footed gait of a bear. Davis, ever the pragmatist, shook his head, his voice a low, forced whisper. He muttered about a large cat, a freakishly big lynx or a mountain lion that had wandered far out of its territory. He cited tracks expanding in the sun, ice distorting the shape, anything to anchor the unknown to the safe, solid ground of the familiar. But I couldn't let it go. The proportions were all wrong, the stride too long, the depth of the impressions speaking of a weight that no natural forest predator should possess. A low, tense argument simmered between us, our words sharp and hushed, highlighting the fracture that the tracks had already begun to carve through our unit's cohesion. Davis saw an animal. I felt the prickle of something else, something that watched from the silent white woods. Sergeant Miller silenced us with a sharp gesture. His eyes, cold and intent, were fixed on the trail. The clawed tracks led away from the camp deeper into the heart of the forest. We followed, our senses stretched to a breaking point, every shadow between the trees a potential threat. The silence was absolute, the normal sounds of a winter forest, the chatter of squirrels, the call of birds conspicuously absent. It was as if the very life of the woods had frozen in fear. The trail ended in a small, sheltered clearing, and there the world stopped making sense. Strung between the high branches of 2 tall pines, maybe 15 feet off the ground, was the carcass of a deer, or what was left of it. The animal had been gutted with a surgical, brutal efficiency, its entrails frozen into garish purple and red ropes draped down toward the snow. Its ribcage was splayed open, picked clean of every morsel of meat, the white bone gleaming in the weak morning light. The head was twisted at an impossible angle, the eyes gone, leaving behind empty, accusing sockets. No bear, no cat, no natural predator of these woods did this. They didn't hoist their kills into the treetops like some grotesque trophy. They didn't arrange the remains with such chilling, deliberate spectacle. The sight defied every law of the forest we knew. A deep, primal cold, far colder than the Minnesota winter, seized me. It wasn't the cold of the air, but the cold of a profound and terrifying wrongness. We stood there, a squad of highly trained soldiers, rendered utterly silent and still by the gutted deer strung high above us, a clear and horrifying sign that we were trespassing in a territory ruled by something we could not comprehend. The silence of the deep woods at night is a living, breathing thing, a presence that presses in on the eardrums with the weight of the frozen dark. My watch was the dead of night, the world reduced to the small, warm circle of light from the kerosene lamp inside the tent and the vast, impenetrable blackness beyond. The cold was a razor, and every breath felt like shards of glass in my lungs. I stood just outside the tent flap, my parka hood pulled tight, the stock of my M16 cold even through my gloves. The stars were a brilliant, indifferent spray across the velvet black sky, their light doing nothing to illuminate the menacing wall of trees that surrounded our camp. The memory of the gutted deer was a fresh wound in my mind, and every shadow seemed to hold the promise of its maker. At first, the sound was so faint I dismissed it as the wind, a trick of the mind born of exhaustion and cold. But it came again, a little clearer this time. A voice. It was Davis's voice, or a perfect, ghostly echo of it, calling my name from the trees to the north. Corbin. Jake. It was laced with a strained urgency, the tone he used when he needed backup on patrol. My body reacted before my mind could catch up, a soldier's instinct to a comrade's call. I took a half step forward, my boots sinking into the fresh powder, my heart hammering against my ribs. The voice called again, closer now, a siren song woven from familiarity and fear. It was him. He was out there, in the dark, in trouble. I was about to call back, to break the one rule Sergeant Miller had hammered into us, never leave the perimeter alone, when a vice-like grip clamped onto my shoulder from behind. I spun, rifle coming up, to find Miller himself, his face a grim mask in the faint light from the tent. His eyes were not on me, but fixed on the blackness from where the voice had come. He didn't speak, just shook his head once, a sharp, final motion. He pulled me back, his grip unyielding, until my heels were on the packed snow of our camp. Only then did he look at me, his gaze boring into mine, and he pointed a single-gloved finger first at his own chest, then at mine, then at the ground. The message was as old as the army itself. We stay together. The sound did not come again. When he was satisfied I was anchored back to reality, Miller woke the others. Inside the cramped tent, huddled around the sputtering lamp, we debated the noise in hushed, tense tones. Davis, wide-eyed and shaken, swore he had been asleep and hadn't made a sound. Chen suggested it was the wind, a freak acoustic phenomenon channeling through the pines. Lee, rubbing sleep from his eyes, muttered about auditory hallucinations, a known effect of extreme cold and fatigue. They built a wall of logic, brick by rational brick, trying to seal out the impossible. But the wall crumbled an hour later. It started as a soft rustle, then coalesced into a chorus of whispers. They wove through the canvas of our tent, insidious and intimate. They didn't call for help this time. They whispered our names. Miller, a low, gravelly imitation of the sergeant's own command voice. Chen, a sibilant, teasing version. Jake, my own name, spoken with a familiarity that felt like a violation. The voices overlapped, a distorted tapestry of our own identities thrown back at us by the hungry dark. They were no longer imitations of distress, but a direct personal address. The fear that had been a slow creep became a tidal wave, freezing the air in our lungs and silencing all debate. We were no longer just being watched, we were being called, The decision to move was made in the gray pre-dawn light, a silent concession to the fear that had taken root in the camp. The whispers had not returned, but their absence was somehow worse, a held breath in the frozen stillness. Sergeant Miller gave the orders with a quiet intensity that brooked no discussion. We were to pack everything, leave no trace, and move to a secondary coordinates .5 clicks to the east. It was standard procedure for a compromised position, but the enemy compromising us was a thing of clawed tracks and stolen voices, a violation of every tactical manual we had ever studied. We moved out with the ingrained precision of our training, a 7-man organism flowing through the skeletal forest. Miller took point, his movements economical and sure. Davis and I flanked, our eyes constantly scanning the monochrome maze of birch and pine. Lee and Chen covered the rear, their footsteps a mirror of our own. We were a picture of military discipline, a force of order in a landscape that had revealed itself to be profoundly chaotic. But the discipline was a thin veneer. Every snapped twig, every sigh of wind through the boughs sent a jolt of adrenaline through the line. The forest felt like a cage, and we were the mice being watched by something unseen in the walls. We found the first sign an hour into the march. A small personal item, Corporal Lee's spare glove, the one he'd reported missing during the frantic pack-up, was lying in the middle of our intended path. It wasn't just dropped, it was placed. The glove was impaled on a sharpened stick driven into the frozen earth, the fingers splayed in a grotesque parody of a wave. Lee stared at it, his face pale, before snatching it and stuffing it into his pack without a word. No one spoke. The message was clear. We were not escaping, we were being followed. The unease curdled into a cold, hard dread when we reached the new location, a rocky bluff overlooking a frozen creek. Scattered across the clearing, arranged in a rough, mocking circle, were the rest of our missing items. A canteen, its canvas cover slashed to ribbons, a box of rations, torn open and the contents smeared across the snow in a brown, foul-looking paste. Most chilling of all was Davis's harmonica, the one he always carried for luck. It was bent in half, the reeds ripped out and scattered around it like metallic seeds. Our gear, our lifelines in this wilderness, had been defiled with a malicious, intelligent spite. This was no animal marking its territory. This was a performance, a taunt. As dusk began to bleed the last of the color from the sky, the rustling started. It was not the wind, it was a dry, skittering sound, like bones being dragged through dead leaves, and it moved through the trees just beyond the edge of our vision. It came from the north, then moments later, echoed from the south, then the east. We were surrounded by a shifting, whispering perimeter of sound. Miller's voice cut through the growing panic, low and sharp. He ordered a defensive perimeter, and we fell into position without thought, our backs to the center of the clearing, rifles pointed out at the darkening woods. The rustling intensified, a symphony of unseen movement. I felt a sickening certainty settle in my gut, a tactical understanding that went beyond fear. We weren't being hunted from a distance. We were being maneuvered. Every step of our retreat, every change in our position had been anticipated. The creature wasn't just chasing us, it was herding us, and the rustling in the trees was the sound of the gate to the slaughter pen being closed. The rustling became a storm of dry, frantic motion in the canopy above, a sound like 1,000 dead leaves taking flight. Sergeant Miller barked an order to hold position, his voice a tight wire of control stretched to its limit. Our rifles tracked the noise, a synchronized sweep of black metal against the deepening twilight. The sound coalesced directly above Davis, and for a fraction of a second, the world seemed to freeze. Then the pine boughs exploded. It was a blur of shadow and impossible speed, a thing of angles and violent motion that defied immediate comprehension. There was a brief, horrifying impression of vast leathery wings, not feathered but taut like a stretched membrane, and a skeletal, elongated form that seemed to drink the fading light. It dropped from the branches in a silent, gravity-driven plunge. Davis had half-turned, his mouth opening to form a sound that never came. The thing struck him like a cannonball, its talons, long, black, and curved like scimitars, sinking into the thick padding of his parka with a sickening tear of fabric and a wet, crunching snap. The impact lifted Davis clean off his feet. A choked, guttural cry was ripped from his throat as the creature, with a single powerful beat of those monstrous wings, reversed its momentum. It ascended, dragging Davis's thrashing form up through the branches and into the darkening sky. The entire event, from the explosion of the boughs to the disappearance into the gloom, lasted less than 3 seconds. A storm of gunfire erupted, a deafening, chaotic roar that shattered the forest's silence. Muzzle flashes strobed against the trees, illuminating frantic, upturned faces. We fired into the canopy, into the space where they had vanished, pouring round after round into the emptiness. Brass casings glittered as they spun through the air, landing with soft hisses in the snow. The smell of cordite was sharp and acrid, a profane incense in the sacred cold. But we were shooting at a ghost. The thing moved with an unnatural fluid speed, a darting shadow already gone from the space our bullets occupied. The gunfire died out, one rifle at a time, until only the ringing in our ears remained. We stood panting, our breath pluming in ragged gasps, staring at the empty space where Private Davis had been standing moments before. The only evidence left was a violent crimson spray across the pristine snow, a constellation of red stars around a deep-dragged furrow. Scattered amongst the gore were torn shreds of his parka, a broken strap from his pack, and his M16, lying discarded in the snow like a forgotten toy. Shock was a physical blow, a cold numbness that spread from the core outward, more paralyzing than the sub-zero temperature. We stood frozen, our training, our discipline, all rendered useless. Miller was the first to move, his face a bloodless mask. He walked to the center of the carnage, his boots leaving dark prints in the red snow. He didn't need to say it. We all knew. In the grim, formal debrief he conducted right there, his voice flat and hollow, he declared Private First Class Evan Davis killed in action. The words hung in the air, final and absolute. Morale didn't just break, it shattered, exploding into a million glittering, irrecoverable pieces. The last vestiges of professional detachment evaporated. This was no longer a training exercise gone wrong, nor was it a confrontation with a dangerous animal. We had been hunted. We had been prey. And the thing that had taken Davis was not of this world. It was fast, it was intelligent, and it was utterly, terrifyingly inhuman. We were 6 men alone in a frozen hell, and we had just been served a brutal, unequivocal reminder of our place in its food chain. The cold was a living entity in the snow cave, a patient predator that had followed us inside. It seeped through the packed walls, numbing our faces and frosting our eyelashes, huddled. Together for warmth that wouldn't come, we were a broken circle of men, our breath pluming in the faint glow of a single, shielded chemlight. The memory of Davis's final moments played on a relentless loop behind my eyes. The blur of motion, the spray of blood, the silent, empty sky. Shock had given way to a deeper, more insidious terror, one that festered in the dark and the quiet. It was in that suffocating silence, with the wind moaning a dirge at the cave entrance, that a ghost from my own past stirred. Months ago, during a brief stop for supplies at a remote trading post, I'd shared a whiskey with an old Ojibwe trapper, a man whose face was a roadmap of winters. His eyes, clouded with age and something else, a deep, weary knowledge, had fixed on me as the snow fell outside. He'd spoken of the woods, not with a woodsman's fondness, but with a grave respect. He told me a story his grandfather had told him, a legend of the deep winter. He called it the Wendigo, not just a beast, but a spirit of hunger and cold, a cannibalistic entity born from starvation and sin. It was eternally ravenous, forever seeking to consume human flesh to sate a cold that burned at its core. And the old man, his voice dropping to a whisper, had described a specific, horrifying detail most versions of the tale omitted. Some legends spoke of it having wings, vast and leathery, not for soaring through the sky, but for moving with an unnatural silence through the frozen forest, a gift from the winter winds themselves. The memory slammed into me with the force of a physical blow. My head snapped up, my eyes meeting the haunted gazes of the others. I didn't speak the name aloud, but the story poured out of me in a choked, hurried whisper. I told them of the spirit, the insatiable hunger, the association with the deepest, most merciless winter. And I told them about the wings. A dam broke inside the cave. The pieces, which had been a chaotic, terrifying jumble, suddenly clicked into a horrifying, coherent picture with the legend as its frame. The distorted tracks, not a bear's, but the skeletal, dragging gait of something emaciated and eternal. The voices in the snow, the Wendigo's infamous mimicry, a psychic lure to draw prey into isolation. The gutted deer in the tree, not a predator's meal, but a spirit's mockery of life, a display of its dominion. And the speed, the impossible, blurring speed of the ambush, the power of a thing that was more wind and shadow than flesh and blood. Fear, which had been a shared burden, curdled into something new and far more dangerous, paranoia. It was Chen who voiced the unthinkable, his words barely audible. The legend wasn't just about a monster in the woods. It was about a curse. It was said that those who resorted to cannibalism in the wilderness, or even those who were exposed to the Wendigo's influence for too long, could become one. Their humanity would wither, replaced by the gnawing, frozen hunger. His words hung in the frigid air, and every pair of eyes in that cave began to dart, to scrutinize. We looked at each other not as comrades but as potential vessels. Was Lee's silence a sign of trauma, or was he listening to a new, colder voice inside his head? Was the frantic gleam in Miller's eyes command responsibility, or the first flicker of an alien hunger? The enemy was no longer just outside, stalking us in the dark. The legend had awakened a terrifying new possibility, that the enemy was already here, huddled among us, waiting for the last vestiges of its humanity to freeze and shatter. We were trapped not only by the creature in the forest, but by the monstrous potential it had planted within our own ranks. Sleep became a phantom, a taunting memory that danced just beyond the reach of our exhaustion. The cold was no longer an external force, it had become internal, a glacial core that pulsed with every sluggish beat of our hearts. In the cramped, frigid darkness of the snow cave, time lost all meaning, measured. Only in the shared, shallow breaths and the constant, gnawing fear. The Wendigo's legend had infected us, a psychic virus that thrived in the petri dish of our sleep-deprived minds. Every flicker of a shadow, every involuntary twitch, was magnified into a potential threat. Corporal Lee was the first to break, his eyes, bloodshot and wide, fixed on me from across the cave. He pointed a trembling, gloved finger, his voice a raw, cracked thing. He accused me of seeing things that weren't there, of whispering to the shadows, of being compromised. He cited the way I'd stared into the forest for too long, the way I flinched at sounds only I could hear. His accusations were wild, unfounded, but they landed with the weight of truth in that paranoid atmosphere. I tried to protest, to appeal to the reason that had long since fled, but my own voice sounded thin and reedy, even to my own ears. The doubt he sowed took root instantly. I saw it in the other's eyes, a new sharp wariness directed at me. Sergeant Miller moved between us, his own fatigue etched deep into the lines of his face. He was a dam trying to hold back a flood of raw, untethered anxiety. He spoke in low, forceful tones about discipline, about unit cohesion, about trusting the man next to you. But his words, once the bedrock of our existence, now sounded hollow, a script from a world that no longer applied. The trust he spoke of had been shredded by claws and poisoned by ancient stories. We were no longer a squad. We were a collection of terrified individuals, each suspecting the other of harboring the frozen hunger. The radio, Miller finally said, his voice cutting through the tension. It was our one remaining tether to sanity, to rescue. Chen scrambled for the handset, his movements frantic with a sudden, desperate hope. He cranked the power, adjusted the frequency, his breath held. He pressed the transmit button. "Echo Base, this is Ranger Team Talon. We are declaring an emergency. Do you copy?" "Over." The only reply was a low, pervasive hiss of static. He tried again, his voice rising in pitch. "Echo Base, any station, this is Talon. We are under attack and require immediate extraction. Does anyone copy?" The static hissed back, a sound like a nest of snakes, utterly featureless and unnaturally constant. It wasn't the empty silence of a dead channel. It was an active, smothering blanket of noise, jamming. The realization was a final, brutal blow. Something out there in the frozen dark didn't just want us dead. It wanted us isolated, utterly and completely alone. The attack came not from the woods, but from the roof of our sanctuary. There was no warning rustle, no whispered taunt. Just a sudden explosive shower of snow and splintered ice as the ceiling of the snow cave shattered inward. A long, black-taloned limb, thin as a sapling and hard as iron, shot down into our midst. It moved with impossible speed, a striking serpent. It wasn't aiming to kill, it was aiming to maim. The talons raked across Corporal Lee's shoulder and back as he scrambled away, tearing through his parka and the flesh beneath as if it were tissue paper. He screamed, a high, awful sound of pure agony, and collapsed face first into the snow, a dark red stain instantly blooming around him. The creature was gone as quickly as it had come, leaving only a gaping hole to the star-filled sky and Lee's writhing, bleeding form. The sight of his blood, so vivid against the white, acted like a spark on a powder keg. The fragile remains of our order disintegrated. Chen shouted that we had to move, that we were sitting ducks in the cave. Miller roared back that moving a critically wounded man in the open was suicide, that we had to fortify and wait. Their argument escalated into a screaming match, faces contorted with rage and terror. Rifles were gripped not toward the hole in the ceiling, but held in white-knuckled hands, the muzzles drifting, pointing at nothing and everything. For one heart-stopping moment, the true enemy was forgotten. The violence brewing in that cave was human, primal, and it was poised to finish the Wendigo's work for it. We were a single shouted word away from turning our guns on each other. The argument ended not with a resolution, but with the ragged, wet sound of Lee's breathing. Each gasp was a desperate, shallow thing, a bellows struggling against a collapsed lung. The sight of his blood, so stark and violent against the snow, was a more effective command than any Sergeant Miller could have given. We had to move. Staying in the shattered cave was a death sentence for all of us. We worked with a frantic, grim efficiency, fashioning a makeshift litter from a torn tent poncho and 2 sturdy pine branches. Lifting Lee onto it was a delicate, horrifying operation. He cried out, a thin, animal sound, as we jostled him, his blood soaking through the fabric and freezing almost instantly. His weight, even diminished, was an anchor of pure despair as we stumbled out into the full fury of the blizzard. The world had vanished into a roaring white madness. The wind screamed, driving needles of ice horizontally, reducing visibility to a few feet. The trees became gray, writhing ghosts in the periphery. We moved in a clumsy, single-file procession, Miller and Chen at the front of the litter, myself and the other 2 remaining rangers at the back, our heads down against the gale. Every step was a battle, our boots breaking through the deepening crust of snow, the litter dragging behind us like a sled of stone. We were a funeral procession in the making, and the blizzard was our pallbearer. The creature did not attack, it harassed. It was a phantom that used the storm as its weapon. From the swirling white to our left, Miller's own voice barked a false order to halt. From the right, Chen's voice screamed a warning about a crevasse directly ahead. The mimicry was flawless, ripped from our memories and twisted into lethal lies. We would falter, the litter would dip, and Lee would groan in fresh agony. The sounds wove around us, a symphony of disorientation conducted by an unseen maestro of malice. It was playing with us, savoring our confusion, letting the cold and our own fear do the bulk of its work. The attack, when it came, was a study in brutal efficiency. There was no dramatic swoop, no shriek of challenge. One moment, Private Evans was at the rear of our ragged line, his head constantly swiveling, his rifle held tight. The next, a shadow detached itself from the blinding white, a swift, low blur that moved against the wind. There was a brief, choked cry, instantly swallowed by the storm's roar, and the sound of a single, muffled gunshot. We spun, weapons coming up, but there was nothing to see. Evans was simply gone. His footprints ended abruptly in the snow, leading to a scuffed, disturbed area already being filled by the driving snow. His rifle lay nearby, a single round spent into the ground. He had managed to get off one shot, a final futile act of defiance that nobody heard. The chaos of his disappearance was absolute. In our frantic turning, we lost our grip on the litter. It tipped, spilling Lee's broken body into the deep snow. He didn't cry out this time. He just lay there, his face a pale, peaceful moon in the storm's fury. By the time we scrambled to him, hauling him back onto the frozen canvas, it was too late. The last of his warmth had fled. His eyes were open, staring up at the featureless white sky with a blank acceptance that was more terrible than any look of fear. The brutal cold and his horrific wounds had finally claimed him. We had been carrying a dead man. We stood over him, the 4 of us who remained, hunched against the wind. There were no words. The blizzard howled its victory. The creature had taken another without a direct fight, using the environment and our own fractured nerves as its allies. It had whittled us down with the precision of a master craftsman. 7 had become 6, then 5, and now we were 4. We were no longer an Army Ranger squad on a mission. We were prey, cornered and bleeding, our hope dwindling with each fallen comrade, counting our losses in the deepening snow and the relentless frozen dark. The blizzard broke at dawn, leaving behind a world of pristine, suffocating silence. The storm's fury was spent, replaced by a cold so profound it felt like the air itself had turned to glass. 4 of us remained, standing over the snow-shrouded forms of our comrades, our breath the only movement in the frozen stillness. Sergeant Miller's face was a mask of frost and grim resolve. There would be no more burials, no more debates. He pointed a stiff, gloved hand toward the southeast, toward a pre-designated emergency extraction point, 10 kilometers away, through the trackless white. It was a distance we could have covered in 2 hours under normal conditions. Now, it felt like a marathon across the surface of the moon. We were going to run. The word was a metaphor for our desperate, lurching flight. Our bodies were battered, our energy reserves depleted to nothing. Frostbite had painted my fingertips and toes a waxy dead white, the numbness a constant, eerie companion. Every step sent jagged bolts of pain shooting up my legs, a reminder of the flesh that was slowly dying. We moved in a staggered line, no longer a tactical formation, but a ragged group of survivors, our movements fueled by pure animal instinct. Miller set a punishing pace, a slow, relentless jog that was just shy of a full collapse. The snow sucked at our boots. The cold air seared our lungs, but we did not stop. To stop was to accept the fate of Davis, of Lee, of Evans. We had little left to fight with, but we used it all. Every few hundred yards, Miller would signal a halt, his eyes scanning the oppressive silent tree line. Chen would fire a parachute flare, the brilliant red eye hissing skyward, painting the snow in a hellish bloody glow. For a few precious seconds, the shadows were banished, the woods exposed. In those moments we would see nothing, but feel everything, the weight of a gaze from the deep dark between the pines. Then, as the flare died, we would hear it, a dry rustle, the crunch of a footstep in the snow that was not our own, always just out of sight, always matching our pace. It was hurting us again, a predator driving its exhausted prey toward a chosen killing ground. On Miller's sharp, gasped command, we would drop to a knee, our suppressed rifles coughing quiet, efficient bursts into the trees where the sound had originated. The thwip-thwip-thwip of the subsonic rounds was a pathetic counterpoint to the creature's silent, looming presence. We weren't trying to kill it, we were buying distance, a few more yards of life with each spent magazine. The spent brass glittered like fallen tears in the snow, tiny monuments to our desperation. And in the rhythm of that desperate flight, the jarring impact of each footfall, the burn in my chest, the stark white of the world, a memory detonated in my mind, not the Minnesota woods, but the jagged, sun-bleached rocks of the Hindu Kush. A sweltering night, a moon not unlike the one that had watched us these past nights. A similar patrol, a similar feeling of being watched from the high passes. A fleeting shadow, vast and winged, passing silently between the peaks, dismissed at the time as a trick of the light. A cultural ghost story from the local villagers. But the shape, the chilling, predatory grace of its movement was identical. The realization was a crack in the foundation of my reality. This was not some isolated terror, a unique monster of the North Woods. It was a pattern, a hunter that transcended continents and climates, a shadow that had fallen on my life long before I ever set foot in this frozen hell. The Army knew, they had to know. The thought was as draining as the physical exertion. My legs became leaden weights, my vision tunneled, the world reducing to the patch of snow directly in front of my boots. The creature's presence was a constant pressure against the back of my neck, an icy breath that had nothing to do with the wind. It was no longer just stalking us. It was measuring us, waiting for the last of our strength to bleed away into the snow, content to let the cold and exhaustion finish its work before it moved in to claim the final frozen prize. We were running, but we were only running toward the end it had already chosen for us. The run ended not with victory, but with the splintered, rotting timbers of salvation. The emergency extraction point was a phantom, a set of coordinates on a map that led only to more trackless wilderness and the ever-present watching silence. It was Chen who spotted it, his voice a cracked, dry rasp as he pointed a trembling finger through a break in the trees, a low, sagging shape huddled against the base of a rocky outcrop, its roof laden with snow like a thick white shroud, an abandoned ranger's station. It was not hope that propelled us toward it, but the final, desperate exhaustion of animals seeking any den to die in. We fell through the door more than we entered, our bodies giving out the moment we crossed the threshold. The interior was a tomb, frozen in time and coated in a fine, glittering layer of frost. A rusty wood stove stood cold in one corner, a broken table and 2 chairs lay overturned nearby, and the skeletal remains of a bunk bed were pushed against the far wall. The single window was a cataract of grime and ice, allowing only a sickly gray light to filter through, but it had 4 walls and a roof. It was a fortress compared to the open snow. Sergeant Miller was moving before the rest of us had even caught our breath, the last dregs of his command instinct taking over. His plan was a masterpiece of grim, last-ditch tactics, a blueprint for our own tomb. Our ammo was critically low, a handful of magazines between the 4 of us. He directed us to lay tripwires at the 2 vulnerable points, the door and the window, using the last of our parachute cord and tying on empty canteens and loose shell casings to act as crude alarms. We pushed a heavy table against the door and stacked the broken chairs and any other debris we could find into a fragile barricade. It was a child's fort against a hurricane, but the act of building it, of doing something, was a lifeline. While the others worked, I found a small waterlogged notebook and a stub of a pencil near the broken stove, discarded by some long-ago ranger. My hands, numb and clumsy with frostbite, struggled to hold the pencil. I began to write. I documented it all, the insertion, the tracks, the voices, the ambushes, the legend of the Wendigo. The words came in a frantic, unbroken stream, scrawled across the page in a shaky hand I barely recognized as my own. I wrote down names, dates, the details of how Davis and Lee and Evans had died, the This was not a report. It was a testament, a confession. I was etching our epitaph onto the paper, a record of our final hours, praying that someone someday would find it and know that we had not simply vanished into the snow. We had been taken by something. As dusk began to bleed the last of the light from the grimy window, the testing began. It started as a slow, deliberate scraping along the outside wall near the door, the sound of a single sharp claw being dragged over the frozen logs. It was a casual, almost bored sound, a predator inspecting the bars of a cage. The scraping moved, circling the small structure, pausing at the window. A shadow fell across the frosted glass, tall and unnaturally thin, blotting out the dying light. Then came the whispers. They did not call our names this time. They spoke in a low, guttural language of hunger and cold, promises of the pain that was coming, descriptions of the warmth it would find inside us. The voice was a composite of every man we had lost, a horrific chorus of the dead speaking with the Wendigo's singular, ravenous intent. We stood with our backs to the cold wood stove, our rifles pointed at the door and the window, our bodies trembling not from the cold, but from a terror so complete it felt like a physical force. The tripwires trembled, the canteens and casings clinking together with a sound like tiny, mocking bells. The creature was not just testing our defenses, it was tasting our fear, savoring the final, climactic moments before the assault. The scratching grew more insistent, the whispers more urgent, building into a terrifying crescendo of sound and threat. The barricade shuddered. The end was no longer approaching. It was at the door. The door exploded inward, not with a crack, but with a deafening, splintering roar. The heavy table, the piled debris, the tripwires with their clattering alarms, they were all rendered utterly meaningless. The Wendigo did not open the door. It obliterated it, a force of nature given a singular, ravenous purpose. It moved in a violent, impossible blur, a creature of jagged shadow and freezing wind made solid. The brief, strobing impression of its form in the gloom was a nightmare-given flesh, a skeletal, emaciated frame, sheathed in taut, gray skin. Limbs too long and ending in those black, scythe-like talons, and a face that was a hollow-eyed skull from which a faint, phosphorescent glow emanated. Its vast, leathery wings filled the shattered doorway for an instant before it was among us. It targeted the closest man first. Private Chen had time only to widen his eyes before a taloned hand swept out, moving faster than a striking cobra. The sound was a wet, terrible tear. He was slammed against the far wall, his body going limp before he even slid to the floor, a dark spreading stain following his descent. The second ranger, a man named Reyes, managed to get his rifle up, firing a 3-round burst into the creature's chest. The rounds impacted with dull, wet thuds, like stones thrown into mud. It barely flinched. It turned its hollow gaze on him, and with a motion too swift to track, a talon lanced out, piercing his throat with surgical precision. He fell, choking silently into the frozen dirt, his weapon clattering beside him. The world had narrowed to the space between the creature, Sergeant Miller, and me. The beast stood over Reyes's body, its head cocked in a gesture of grotesque curiosity. It was between us and the ruined doorway, a wall of frozen death. Miller didn't shout, didn't hesitate. He moved with the calm, fluid precision of a man who had already accepted his fate. He dropped to one knee, bringing his M16 to his shoulder, his eye fixed down the sights. "Now, Corbin, the glow," he roared. I understood. The faint, sickly light emanating from the creature's chest, right where Reyes's rounds had struck. It wasn't a wound, it was a target, a core. I mirrored Miller's stance, my frostbitten fingers clumsy on the cold metal of my rifle. The creature began to turn toward the sergeant, its movements a study in predatory grace. Time seemed to stretch, to slow to a crawl. I saw the individual strands of matted fur on its limbs, the way the frost on its wings caught the dim light. I saw Miller, his face a mask of absolute focus, his finger taking up the slack on the trigger. Our shots were a single unified crack that shattered the ringing in my ears. Miller's round and mine struck home, a perfect, simultaneous impact just below the creature's hollow sternum. The effect was immediate and violent. The faint glow in its chest flared into a blinding, actinic burst of white light, and the Wendigo let out a sound that was not a shriek but a roar of pure, frigid agony, a noise like a glacier calving into a silent sea. It recoiled, stumbling back through the shattered doorway, clutching at the wound, a substance that was not blood, but a thick, black ichor that smoked in the freezing air, poured from between its talons. It gave us one last, hate-filled look from its empty sockets, before it turned and vanished into the night, its departure a rustle of disturbed air rather than the beat of wings. A profound, ringing silence descended upon the ranger station. It was broken by a wet, ragged gasp. I turned. Sergeant Miller was on his knees, one hand pressed to his abdomen. In the creature's frantic retreat, one of those scything talons had found its mark. He lowered his hand, revealing a deep, horrific gash that had torn through his parka and into his gut. The dark fabric of his gear was already saturated, the blood a shocking, warm red against the frozen grime of the floor. I rushed to him, applying pressure with a piece of torn tent fabric from my pack, but it was futile. The wound was too deep, too catastrophic. He batted my hands away, his strength fading fast. His eyes, clouded with pain, found mine and held them with an iron will. "Corbin," he whispered, each word a labor. "Listen. You survive. You get out of these woods. You tell them what's out here." A fit of coughing racked his frame, speckling his lips with blood. "The truth. Don't let them bury this." His head lolled back against the splintered doorframe, his gaze fixed on the star-filled hole where the door had been. His chest rose once, twice, and then fell for the final time. The last of the warmth left his body, surrendering to the cold that had been waiting for him all along. And then there was only silence. The groaning of the wind through the broken timbers, the faint coppery smell of blood, the utter, absolute dark. I was alone, surrounded by the frozen bodies of my comrades in a tomb of wood and snow, with the truth of what had happened a crushing weight on my soul and the dying words of my sergeant the only thing left to keep me company in the frozen dark. The first thrum of the rotors was a sound from another life, a vibration that felt alien after days of unnatural silence and screaming wind. Dawn broke, not with hope, but with a pale, watery light that seeped through the shattered remains of the ranger station, illuminating the frozen horror within. I did not stand to greet my rescuers. I merely sat with my back against the cold wood stove, Sergeant Miller's body nearby, my rifle lying useless across my lap. The Black Hawks descended into the clearing like great mechanical dragonflies, their downdraft churning the blood-stained snow into a pink gruel. Men in clean cold-weather gear spilled out, their movements sharp and efficient. They were not here for a rescue, they were here for a recovery. They separated me from the scene with a clinical, impersonal speed. A medic wrapped a shock blanket around my shoulders, his eyes avoiding mine as he did a perfunctory check for injuries. He noted the frostbite, the superficial cuts, but asked no questions about the deeper wounds, the ones that didn't bleed. I was ushered onto one of the helicopters, seated away from the windows, while other teams in unmarked winter camouflage began the grim work of bagging and loading the bodies of my team. The whole operation had a rehearsed, sterile quality to it, a practiced ritual for containing a mess. The isolation began the moment we touched down at a secure, nondescript military facility somewhere in Minnesota. I was led down a corridor of gleaming linoleum and pale green walls, the air smelling of antiseptic and stale coffee. They put me in a small, windowless room containing only a metal table and 2 chairs. The debriefing was not an inquiry, it was an inoculation. 2 officers in crisp Class B uniforms, their faces devoid of expression, sat across from me. They never gave their names. They presented a narrative, already written, a story of a tragic training exercise gone awry, hypothermia-induced hallucinations, a rogue bear, perhaps a rabid one, accounting for the violence, a series of terrible coincidental accidents in unforgiving terrain. They slid a stack of documents toward me, the pages crisp and official, statements of incident, casualty reports, my own sworn testimony already typed out for me, a neat, sanitized version of events that meticulously erased the wendigo, the mimicry, the winged shadow. They provided a pen. Their politeness was a form of pressure more immense than any shouted command. They spoke of my duty, of national security, of the importance of a unified story to protect the families from unnecessary horror. They spoke of an honorable discharge, a quiet pension, a chance to put it all behind me. The unspoken alternative hung in the air, colder than the North Woods had ever been. I signed. The pen felt like a betrayal in my hand, the scratch of its tip on the paper the sound of a tombstone sealing shut. Months bled into a gray-haunted year. The discharge came through, as promised. The pension was deposited into a lonely bank account. I rented a small, sparse apartment in a city that felt too loud and too bright. The constant hum of traffic a poor substitute for the whispering pines. Sleep was a battleground I always lost. Every flicker of a street lamp through the blinds was a darting shadow. Every rustle of a tree outside my window was the sound of claws on frozen logs. I was a ghost in my own life, haunted by the faces of Davis, Chen, Reyes, and Miller, their final moments playing on an endless loop behind my eyes. The official story was a cage, and I was its sole tormented occupant. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday. There was no return address, just my name and address typed in a generic font. Inside was a single folded slip of plain paper. The message was brief, typed on the same anonymous machine. They never found the body. It's still out there. They're digging a deeper hole. Watch your back. The words were simple, but their meaning was a seismic shock that shattered the fragile peace I had constructed. The Army hadn't just covered it up. They were actively managing it, burying the incident under layers of bureaucracy and lies. The creature had not been a singular monster, but a recurring problem, a secret to be contained. And I, the lone survivor who had signed their lies, was a loose end. A liability. The four walls of my apartment, which had felt like a prison, suddenly felt like no protection at all. The creature was still active, a permanent ravenous shadow in the world's dark corners, and the very institution I had sworn to serve was its accomplice. The note wasn't a warning, it was a sentence. I would never be safe, not from the thing in the woods, and not from the men who had buried the truth. The cold of that Minnesota winter had followed me home, and it had found a permanent place to live deep inside my bones.